Grace is the clinic director at SOMA, Counseling and Family Resources. She is a registered clinical counselor as well as a Canadian certified counselor. Here you go. She's a member of the Christian Principles Association of BC and is a board director of the Gifted Children Association of British Columbia. Grace has lectured at the University of British Columbia and for the Society of Christian Schools in British Columbia. She wanted to let you know she does feel the strong burden to be an advocate to bring healing into families. Her specialization is in trauma and family counseling. So Grace is driven to reduce the stigma, there it is that word again, attached to counseling or being counseled, to deliver outstanding counseling to the community and to work in collaboration with pastors and with churches. So if you're part of a church or you're a pastor here today, you can definitely speak to Grace at SOMA, and of course Fiona, who's connected to Sanctuary Ministries as well. She believes that healing takes place within community and not a part of it, not apart from it, which of course Brian had just told us as well. So Grace, I'm going to have just my first question for you is this. What personal connection to mental illness do you have? I'm going to start right, we're going to go from the clinical straight into the personal. So,
for over 20 years, I've been teaching, I've been counseling, and I'm actually currently a vice principal as well. Doing a lot of really psycho-educational workshops, working with parents, working with the community. Actually, my first master's was with UBC, and I did a really interesting research about teacher health, about new teachers, and how can we prevent burnout and stress and anxiety for teachers so that they can actually better teach in the classroom. So that's part of how it all got started. And then just being in the school system and in the church as well, but specifically in the school system, just working with students. They come to the office, into my office a lot of times with behavioral issues, but it's never just one thing. So when it's a behavioral issue, they come in, their mom or their dad is present, and it turns into this whole family counseling situation that you can sense the tension and just the conflicts that are in the room. And I really felt a huge compassion for the families, so that when they actually leave my office, that some little bit more can be done for them. And so, and as well, working with in the high school with early psychosis intervention teams in the community. There's a lot of early onset of psychosis as well with the teens, dealing with just a lot of different issues that have to do with mental health, on top of anxiety and stress. And then my connection as well is I grew up as a pastor's daughter. My parents actually planted churches all across Canada. So there's a lot of things around just growing up in the church with depression and anxiety, but it's never talked about. There's even schizophrenia, like a member who has schizophrenia, you don't talk about it. You know there's something wrong, but you just don't talk about it. But sometimes, as a kid growing up, I overhear conversations, right? And you know something's going on, but you don't exactly know what it is. And then currently my husband is also a pastor. We've been in the congregation in New Life down Maine for about 14 years now. And as a pastor's wife, of course, there's also in ministry a lot of issues, mental health issues that we talk about in ministry. That's very important. And then on a more personal level, having dealt with a lot of anxiety, having gone through a hard period of depression as well myself, with the birth of my first child, all of that integrated into one piece. I was thinking, God, what is this all about? So as I reflect back on my own life, I've dealt with this, I've seen this. What is it that you want me to do? And so in 2010, a friend and I got together and we started praying for the city and started brainstorming about what we can do with all that God has shown us for the city of Vancouver. And we decided at that time that SOMA, counseling and family resources, was a good direction to head. And so we started visioning and brainstorming about how can we bring healing into the body of Christ. And how can we bring these mental health issues more out in the open and talk about it and discuss it? And how can we bring Jesus, Christ-centered healing into counseling, and how do we integrate that piece? And being able to have individuals be able to feel like they can thrive and flourish in the communities, in the church communities that they attend.
Well, I mean, we heard from your introduction that you've given me to tell everybody about yourself that Soma Counseling Family Resources is designed to help people thrive in their own church communities. People who struggle with mental health disorders or mental health issues. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I think a story that I really like to tell is actually as we were brainstorming and envisioning what we can do for the city and for the churches here in Vancouver, is one research that we came across at the University of British Columbia. So I remember sitting there and listening to this counselor talk about how in North America, when we do counseling, the majority of the counseling we do is talk therapy. In a room, you and I, and we talk. It's isolated. It's pseudo in the sense that you feel unconditional positive regard in this kind of session, but then when you go back out, you still have life to live. You have to go back to your families, you have to go back. So the research was actually done in Rwanda, and the topic that they were researching about was actually about forgiveness. So in these small communities where the war happened, and the small communities in the villages, what happened during the genocide was that there's men that turned against men, neighbors that turned against neighbors. So men killed men, and it just created this really, really dark presence that was left in the community, because now there were lots of widows and lots of children left in the community. So then a couple of years later, these men were actually, because of the pardoning, was released back into these communities where they committed some of these murders. And so the research was about, so can we bring a widow and the person who committed the crime, murdered her husband, into talk therapy and bring forgiveness and reconciliation? So they did that. They tried for weeks and weeks and weeks. The woman on the video was just sitting there, and she was angry and upset and really stuck, and reconciliation really wasn't happening. And so what happened was, through the research, they found out that actually instead of sitting, maybe let's do something. So the widow was asked to make a list. So she made a list of all the work that that her husband would have done if he were still alive, to work the land, to build the fences, to take care of the household, and she made a list. And she gave this list to this person, the murderer, and actually he started, that's what he was gonna do. He was gonna do something to ask for forgiveness or to step closer to reconciliation. And so the first week he was there, he was working the land, and you can see the footage of the woman sitting there like, yeah, you deserve this, under the sun, you deserve this. So she was just really kind of upset. He was still working. Second week, third week, fourth week, she started to give him some water. And then through the weeks, she actually started sitting beside him. And I think what I heard as I was sitting there with this research is that secular research at UBC is showing that forgiveness can be possible. Reconciliation can be possible. Instead of just talk therapy, let's do it. So I was sitting there going, whoa, well, instead of just talking about depression of this member that's in my heart in our congregation, maybe we should do something with him. Maybe we can serve together. Maybe he loves cooking, so maybe we can cook up something, we can do something together. So I was sitting there and I was thinking, wow, why can't churches do that? Take research, current research, and be able to do ministry and bring healing with it. Because forgiveness is what Christ is about. Reconciliation is what we're about. So why can't we take this research in a secular place and bring it and flesh it out with pastors and ministry leaders, youth leaders, and why don't we do something about it as a church to bring healing? And so that's the vision for Soma.
And you had mentioned that you had personally struggled with depression. It sounds like it was postpartum. I don't know if that's right or not, but it sounds like that's what it was. And maybe share a little bit more about that journey, but specifically, how did the church play a role in walking alongside you during that time, and maybe some of this model, maybe you saw some of this in the church that you were attending?
Yeah, To be honest, it was really difficult. And I think I struggled with the dichotomy of what I knew to be true, of God's love for me and God's presence with me, that He's present, but then also the isolation of how I felt and the darkness of how I felt, and that was true too. So what I knew was true and how I felt was also true, so I really struggled with that. And so finally I actually, at the peak of the depression, reached out for my doctor, and she gave me a prescription. And at that point, I actually really didn't know of anyone who openly admitted that they struggled with mental illness. And I had a really, really poor concept of what medication did. But then through that time, it was a personal journey. It was a personal journey because the people at the church really didn't know that I was struggling. And so at the same time, my husband was in ministry, he was the pastor, and I was struggling. And so I guess, did my own congregation play a role? Because I didn't share with them, of course they couldn't play a role. And I actually didn't feel safe enough to share with them. And I guess it's nothing really new for me, being a pastor's kid growing up. And I think and my mother also has suffered depression as well herself. So actually walking and journeying as a child of somebody who suffered with depression and growing up in the church, seeing that she didn't do anything about it, it was hush hush, it wasn't shared. So that really probably was why I didn't share it myself as well. And there's just a lot of stigma, I think. I think I read some research about pastors' families. So that's one of the things that we have a heart for at SOMA, is for pastors and their families, and ministry leaders and their families. The research actually shows that growing up as a pastor's child or in a pastor's family shows very similar symptoms and onlook as that were similar to firemen and policemen children. So what it means is that it's difficult. They're always on the forefront. And so what does that mean? It's hard for them to feel safe. So there's a lot of anxiety growing up in situations like that.
Well, let's talk about anxiety for a moment. Is there a link between anxiety and depression together? You've talked a little bit about depression so far, but we often hear about these two things paired together. How would you define anxiety?
Yeah, I think we can. There's a picture, a cartoon that I brought. Yeah, this one. So it's a link between anxiety and depression. I think on this side we have the two rocks. Okay. So the first one
Those
is
are rocks.
Yeah, they're huge rocks.
Not potatoes.
Huge boulders.
Misshapen eggs.
So, that's right. So this one, the darker gray one, is really, I guess, just a depiction, a metaphor of what depression actually looks like. So the rock does not look like he's having fun. There's no pleasure. He's kind of like slow when he has to move. He's heavy. Probably a lot of guilt. Also probably sleeps a lot during the day and not a lot during the night. That's depression. Anxiety on the other side, the lighter gray, is kind of shaky, hypervigilance, like very jumpy, very kind of worried, always thinking about fight, flight, or freeze. So he's always thinking, okay, if it's not safe, I'm going to either fight it, like get really angry or agitated, or I'm going to kind of escape it. I don't want to do this. This is too hard for me. Or freeze, like I really don't know what to do. So very tense. So that's the depiction of depression and then anxiety. And I think the link between the two, there's a chart of, if we kind of move the next cartoon. I don't think I can.
I think you can do it.
Can I do it? So it says here in the cartoon, even with the medication, I still have those days when I have to force myself out of bed. And so the metaphor here is that depression and anxiety coming together, and it really is suffocating. Really is hard for you to move. And that's a very similar experience of how I felt. There's a chart in the middle, the overlap is that if you have to deal with anxiety and depression, it's you're in a panic, you withdraw, things in life really change and shifts. There's also a lot of complaints of physical kind of pains and like gastrointestinal problems or chronic pain, or you're really tired all the time and just really in distress. And things are really dysfunctional, and insomnia. It's very difficult to sleep at all. So that's the link.
Is it pretty common in BC for anxiety and depression? I mean, who does it tend to affect?
Mm-hmm. I have stats as well here. I'm going to move on. Anxiety disorders. Very common mental illness in Canada. It's the most common. Percentage of population affected is actually 9% is men and 16% women. Currently, it's anxiety, it's about 12% of BC's population. 1 in 8 people are actually dealing with an anxiety disorder. So that's actually quite a huge stat. Most common form of psychological distress as well in childhood and youth, in teen years. And about 28.8% of children will develop an anxiety disorder during their lifetime. And so it's a huge issue. I brought with me in the back some books. They're coil bound. I think Sarah can help with that as well. They're actually what the BC Ministry has given out. They are thinking that because anxiety is such a huge issue, they are putting into our schools, public and independent schools, this resource to actually help our kids be more resilient towards anxiety and depression. And what it is in kindergarten classes, they're teaching them mindfulness strategies, how to deep breathe, how to actually be able to calm their own bodies down. And then in grades 3 and 4, they're doing that again. And then in grade 6 and 7, in middle school years, they're also doing that again. The goal is actually to minimize depression during the senior years. This is grade 10, 11, and 12. Because the research is showing in BC, there's a lot of anxiety and depression issues going on in the senior years, in grade 11 and 12. And it really is a tough issue to deal with when they haven't been able to be taught the skills at a younger age.
Well, I have one more question. What is, if you could describe it, the healing journey like for someone with anxiety and depression, and how can we help those with anxiety and depression, both as individuals, maybe as a faith community? What are your suggestions about that?
I had a client about 50 years old and was really dealing with chronic pain and from a car accident, and had to deal with anxiety and depression. She was worried that her grade 11 daughter will also get into an accident all the time, so very, very high-strung about her just going places by herself. Her husband works long hours, so she's alone a lot of the times. So dealing with the chronic pain and dealing with anxiety and depression was not a good combination. During my time with her at the UBC clinic, actually, I met with her for almost 9 months, weekly, and spending a lot of time with her. And during our 9 months together, she's walked herself into the emergency room a couple of times dealing with suicidal thoughts. We've made like 4 or 5 suicide safety plans because of her suicide and ideation. And so, to answer the question, how can we journey with somebody? I think we can learn from what she said. Our last session together, I asked her, I've journeyed with you for 9 months now. What helped and what didn't help? And this is her response. She said, actually, Grace, what really helped was that you listened to me for these 9 months. And you didn't judge me. I didn't feel judged. And I actually looked forward to our meetings. They were lifelines. By listening to me, you gave me hope. You actually became a protective factor. Because as we make suicide safety plans for suicide ideation, we always talk about what are your protective factors? What are your reasons to live? Let's list them out. And so she said that. She said, Grace, you gave me hope. You became a protective factor, a reason for me to live. And our last session together, I gave her a rock with the word hope on it.
Not like these rocks.
Not like these rocks. And so I think for me, it was just refreshing because in a secular UBC counseling clinic, I just thought the gospel was So it was present. I gave her a rock with the word hope on it. God's hope comes out. And I think those are the recommendations for us, for churches, is to listen non-judgmentally, to walk with them, be there as long as it takes. And then the piece about self-care. So as you're ministering to people, you're also carrying those rocks. And it does affect you. The research does show that it'll affect you. And so what you need to do is you have to have self-care. So how do you care for yourself? How do you know what your boundaries are? And then join workshops and conferences like this is wonderful. Learn about what the research is saying, and study about the issues, the mental health issues, and pray. I think that's what we can do, is pray for them, because no one is alone.
Well, thank you very much.